This is a live instant oatmeal stream here on YouTube's fabulous and yet deeply flawed live streaming platform. This is take two. Take one told me that nobody could hear me, that the internal mic wasn't working. Well, it wasn't even that. Something to do with the software here and how YouTube manages it. So, hello, Crypt Zombie. Hello, everyone. YouTube has really developed this software a lot. Typing as I speak here. In the last 5 years. But let me tell you, it's all a bit try and see in 2018. Good. All right, fabulous. I'm sure you can hear me, and the sound quality is pretty not all that great. But for whatever reason, I had a higher quality microphone to plug in, and YouTube would not cooperate with that. They would only cooperate with this one. Well, I'm gonna have to turn off some of these lights so I'm not bothering my girlfriend too terribly much. I wonder if my girlfriend is in the next room watching my live stream. What are you watching, babe? No? No? If you go to my channel, it's just listed on there. No, I think that's great. You can comment too. You can type in, you can ask me questions. This is your chance to ask me questions, Melissa. You never get to talk to me. So, you know. In fact, I think I prefer, hey, shout out, James Newman's in the room. That's cool. Yeah, longtime supporter James Newman. James Newman, who watched us as we boldly enrolled in baking college, learning how to bake for the purpose of vegan activism, and we just as boldly dropped out of vegan baking college. One disaster after another around here. Okay, so Editark, you ask an interesting question. What do I think of the First Nations exhibits in the Museum of Victoria? So the answer to that question is you're referring to here the Provincial Museum, or I think it's officially the Royal Provincial Museum of BC here in Victoria. And I have never seen it once, partly because it is unbelievably expensive. What I have seen are the First Nations museums in Vancouver. And I'm in Vancouver right now, as it happens, but I did not see them today. So I can comment on that. But yeah, when I was at University of Victoria and still trying really hard to work on First Nations languages there, they admitted, they kind of were aware that none of the university students could really afford to see the museum exhibitions themselves. So they would always let them know, like, oh, on some particular day it's half price or it's free under certain circumstances if you go there on a certain day at a certain time. But it was all a bit pathetic, reflecting, you know, fundamentally unsustainable price levels that these museums were charging. But yeah, in Vancouver, the big impressive First Nations Museum of Indigenous People and Culture is part of the university. It's part of the UBC campus. And it takes a fine art approach, is what it is. There was also a very impressive Museum of First Nations People and Culture in Ottawa years ago. I was told the Conservative government had actually cut the support out from it. So I wonder how it's changed since that allegedly happened. But they might have only cut the support out of new research and not out of just maintaining the exhibitry that was already there. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. The fine art approach tends to center around celebration when the whole point is, you know, there's not a lot to celebrate. You're celebrating a tragedy, or it's worth questioning what is it we're supposed to be celebrating. Yeah. Anyway, guys, I'm sure you can tell this is a completely spontaneous live stream while I'm eating oatmeal in a hotel, instant oatmeal, in a hotel room here in Victoria. Great to see a good crowd show up. Great to see how this platform has evolved. Used to be that live streaming on YouTube was a real disaster. It feels like about a year ago the last time we tried. Seems like some of these things. I just checked on both YouTube and YouNow to see if there was even one other vegan live streamer, and the answer was absolutely zero. I had no competition. There was nobody else online doing it. I didn't come on here with an agenda or a list of topics to talk about, but I could probably make a couple up now. I could probably come up with some on the fly. When I was on the boat on the way over here, I just came over on a ferry. I had one issue in mind. The problem was the issue was a little bit too simple. Normally when I talk about political issues, they either have to be deep or complex enough to have a few different directions taken on in the course of the video. But I could do it. What was the thing I was thinking about commenting on? Why it was our museums in Canada, why it was our universities in Canada are so mediocre at best. Comment from Arthur Freminger. Maybe that microphone needs to go on an acne diet. Yeah. I do, in fact, have a negative review of this microphone already on YouTube. It's beautiful, though. The industrial design is gorgeous. But you've already noticed the disadvantages, including actually recording sound. Actually, using it for recording and broadcasting sound is not that great. But the housing, the design, and what it looks like, the aesthetics are really excellent. All right. Aren't all museums that display war spoils and profit off them inherently problematic? No, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think we can come up with at least a hypothetical situation in which it's not too problematic or not too bad. It really depends on the approach taken by the museum. These current museums we're talking about now, they're really not war spoils. All of the Indigenous peoples' art is much more recent than that. So it's taking a fine arts approach to collecting and displaying works of art by First Nations people just from the last 100 years kind of thing. Well, if what you want to do is tell the history of the Holocaust, you're not going to do that by having a fine art exhibition of art by contemporary Jewish painters or something. It's not going to broach that. It's not going to broach that politics and history. You're not going to deal with the language. You're not going to deal with the history of colonialism. You're not going to deal with questions of, well, folkways is the term used, of subsistence hunting and material culture and what have you. And, you're not going to deal with another thing people here will react. You won't deal with questions of diet, which are even interesting, making the transition from a hunter-gatherer-based diet to how things work today. All kinds of challenging and interesting issues to deal with. Access to education, access to healthcare. There are a million interesting things to do. But if your approach in the museum is just to say, hey, here's a really good wood carving. Here's a really good carving of a raven. Here's another really good carving of a raven, by a different artist. Compare. There's not a lot of content in that for the people coming to see them. And I think it gives everyone a reassuring illusion that the government and society as a whole is doing just fine with Indigenous people. Indigenous people are doing just fine in society. And in reality, this is like the footnote to cultural genocide. Jamie Marshall asked a provocative question. Is this a mukbang? Sadly, that depends entirely on whether or not you find it erotic. How do you feel about Indigenous people using culture traditions to justify hunting or wearing animals? I'm a native myself, but I'm vegan. So, Nicholas, this is something I talked about with First Nations people, mostly in Saskatchewan. In my direct experience, they were all really open to and really interested in veganism because although it's true, they had a kind of sentimental attachment to hunting for the same reason and by the same token. They were really, really hostile towards factory farming and supermarket-based meat. So there tended to be a little bit of dynamic openness to hearing bad things about, And so in terms of First Nations in central Canada, the Cree and Ojibwe, they go all the way to Ontario and Quebec, by the way, and they go all the way west to the edge of the prairies, a little bit into the province of BC. But anyway, groups like the Cree and Ojibwe, there's a similar internal fissure in terms of how they think about tobacco So if you say cigarettes are evil, no problem. Talking about factory-produced cigarettes. But if you say tobacco is evil, that's actually very controversial because tobacco is part of their traditional culture, traditional religion, and it's a traditional medicine, so to speak. So, you know, that kind of traditional attachment to traditional culture, but only when it's in some sense really traditional or traditional enough. Yeah, Jessica asks, what's the song that you still tell me your videos? Da-da-da-da-da. I think I have to keep that a secret. I think I have to keep that a secret. I think that one, I'm under professional legal constraints. I'm under advice from my lawyer to keep that to myself. My girlfriend might know. My girlfriend might know which song it's taken from. Some of my long time fans might know too. If you've watched all 1,100 videos on the channel, you might know also. Anyway, sorry. Let's talk a little bit more about Nicholas Cann's comment. Yeah, I mean, I think that veganism thrives where people are willing to ask the question. And Indigenous peoples of Canada are in a period of their life where, period of the century, when they're asking a lot of new questions and thinking about new ideas, new directions. One of the main sources of change has been the proliferation of the internet. And what used to be very, very isolated people now have access to new ideas around the world through the internet. So I found basically every single First Nations person I met was really interested in Buddhism. And were really eager to talk to someone who knew about Buddhism. You know, I think there probably was something similar in the 1970s when maybe black people in America first discovered Buddhism through Kung Fu movies, you know. So by the same token, I mean, it's just something new, it's something exciting. And I mean, First Nations in Canada, they're aware that their diet is killing them. They're aware. I mean, you can be on some First Nations reservations where the adult obesity rate is 100%, where, you know, there are children who are not overweight, and there might be a couple of elderly people who are not overweight, but most of the elderly people too, where absolutely everyone is overweight, and they know the diet they're on is not working for them. So even if it is traditional to some extent, you know, even if there's a contact with tradition where they're willing to at least ask those questions. I mean, the other thing is, look, I mean, the whole tradition within the Cree and other First Nations traditions are similar to some extent. The whole tradition of really treating animals as living, thinking people, basically regarding them as people that happen to be animals, if you could put it that way. You know, talking about, I mean, especially animals with 4 feet, or what do you want to say, animals like the wolverine. You know, traditionally looking at the wolverine as really like a type of person. Obviously, it's some animals more than others. Wolverines and wolves, you know, they don't seem to talk about beaver to that same extent. But no, they're quite fond of beaver too. They know how clever and intelligent beaver are. And I mean, it varies. It varies from species to species. But there's definitely a lot of discourse, you know, examining these animals and their behavior and talking about them, not just in mythology, but really as if they're a person that happens to be in animal skin. So there are a lot of things that create a radical receptivity to the fundamental questions of veganism. Are there also elements of the culture that are hostile? Of course. But, you know, if you can get 5% of people to listen to you, you know, that's a lot better than standing on the street corner in downtown Vancouver, you know, and trying to sell veganism to random strangers. You know, so, I mean, a really interesting parallel or comparison would be to look at First Nations people, which, by the way, if you guys don't know, that means Indigenous people, American Indians, these other words, Native people, this part of the world. Compare First Nations people to Chinese people. So Chinese people do have an historical tradition involving veganism and vegetarianism. But does that really make them more receptive? Does that make them more open to taking on and thinking about, you know, veganism? I'd say probably the answer is no. I'd say, you know, even though they're familiar with vegetarianism and veganism in Chinese culture, it probably doesn't make them more open. It makes them more close-minded about it. because they kind of feel like, yeah, we've already known about this for 2,000, 3,000, maybe let's say 2,000 to 3,000 years, somewhere in that range. Conservatively, 3,000 years, I guess. We've already had these ideas in Chinese culture for a long time. We already associate it with superstition and backwardness and ghosts and being afraid of your dead ancestors and this kind of thing. So that's very different from a tradition like the Cree and Ojibwe, where they do have a tradition that values animals, animal life, and animal intelligence. But their traditional diet was unbelievably carnivorous. They really, really lived on meat, including goose and beaver and fish. It was, they really neglected sources of vegetable nutrition that surrounded them, even in the Canadian climate, even in northern Saskatchewan, because they were focused totally on consumption of meat. And again, some people may lie to you about that, but you can read the real anthropological studies that get into exactly what they ate and what the archaeological and other evidence was. And that was cultural. They really were predominantly motivated to eat this very, very high meat diet. And again, today, they know it themselves. I mean, they see what healthy people look like on TV. They see what healthy people look like on the internet. And they look around their own communities, their own reservations, and they know. They have an obesity epidemic. They also have an alcoholism epidemic and a cigarette smoking epidemic. They have addiction to painkillers epidemic. They have a lot of these problems. There was a TV show kicked off by a partly, no, I'm sorry. The woman was Mohawk. She was partly Mohawk, and she had been an Olympic athlete. And she started a TV show that was a kind of First Nations challenge for getting in shape, losing weight, being more athletic, trying to athleticize and make more aware of health and diet, First Nations people in Canada. I don't know if the TV show was any good. It was, by the way, I saw advertising for that TV show and thought, well, wasn't that kind of inevitable to have this sort of question of the modern Western diet and health brought to First Nations people? Yeah, and that question is not going to be asked once. It's going to be asked 10,000 times, here on YouTube and on cable television and so on and so forth. So Nicholas Can says, I would also very much enjoy hearing what your experience is working with First Nations in Canada. I'm going to a Native college, and I feel I may be the only vegan. So, Nicholas, I actually did a bunch of research on Native American colleges or American Indian colleges while I was in China. And I presented to the students, and I had the students do research assignments on, and they had to come back and teach the class about Native universities and Native colleges in the States. It's a very interesting history, especially given, of course, the racial politics of the United States of America being predominantly black versus white. This idea of having specially funded Indigenous Peoples colleges, and then how that's worked out in different scenarios. So, and I did some research into it, and anyway, it's a fascinating case study where, as is so often the case with the federal government of the United States, there were some good intentions there, but it was really kind of too little, too late. In many, many cases, the results, are such small and underfunded, struggling to exist colleges and universities that they, the question is asked, should they just be folded into other larger universities? And of course, that question is asked about many African-American, they're normally called historically black colleges, but the African-American colleges that have a similar history. So it is a real struggle, the American Indian education system, which at university level, tertiary level, colleges and universities in the States. And to my knowledge, almost none of them are defined by the language. They are, because of the financial pressure on them. Almost every single case study I looked at were really focused on providing people with careers like nursing that would really reliably get them a good income. And I did not see examples of universities. Okay, I guess I saw one. I saw one example of a university that ostensibly had some commitment to research and revival of the Indigenous language. But yeah, it's tough. And I'm enjoying talking to Nicholas about this. I don't know, probably the majority of my audience is This is it's not the conversation they expect to come in on. Hey, but I don't know if you've heard me. My voice carries. I know we're talking about First Nations education and what it's like talking about veganism with Cree and Ojibwe people and some other First Nations people. Yeah. Sorry. So I'm trying to go through all the questions in order here. So a question from Editark. How do you find you should respond to a lot of people's ideas that First Nations people are lazy? Okay, so there's a very specific question, and I'll tell you how in real life I answered that. So normally I would know the particular geography involved. Now, in this case, I'm not going to use particular names. So let's say you're talking about, I have to make up a name now that's not, okay, let's say there's a reservation that's called Red Feather Reservation. So to my knowledge, that's not the real name of the reservation. And just down the road from Red Feather Reservation, the nearest town of white settlers is going to be called something crappy like Georgeville. Okay? So people would say to me, and including First Nations people would say to me, the problem with Red Feather is that everyone is lazy or is an alcoholic or both. And I would ask them, have you spent any time in Georgeville down the street? And they'd be really surprised when I asked that question. I'd mentioned one of the cities or towns that were close by. And normally they'd say no. Aside from the bus passing through, I've really never been there. And I said, do you think that, poor white people in Georgeville there in the white town next door, do you think they have some of the same problems with alcoholism and unemployment and stuff? And normally those towns, the adjacent white towns in this part of Canada, were really hopeless, were really, really, suicide-inducing towns. So, I mean, this is not the case everywhere. If you were having this conversation in Hawaii, you probably can't say, oh, well, have you been to Honolulu? Probably Honolulu. I've never been there. Probably Honolulu is a pretty optimistic place. But in questioning this, I would just lead it in a Socratic way. And normally what the person would admit to themselves, and just reflecting on it for a minute, because even though they hadn't been to Georgeville, they'd been to Westchester or some other white town with a white name nearby. And after they just thought about it for a while, they'd think, you know what, you're right. Maybe things are 20% worse on the reservation. Like the level of alcoholism is like 20% worse, but you know what? It's not 100% worse. Like, you know what? When you really put it in perspective in that context, this is a part of the country with chronic problems with alcoholism, chronic problems with obesity, chronic problems with drug addiction, let's say opiates, prescription drugs, a lot of this stuff. And, large percentage of the women who are even a little bit good looking being recruited into prostitution and stripping. These are really endemic elements of a very, very, hopeless and depressing setting, the situation out there. Now, again, I don't think what I've just said would apply that directly to, say, the situation of Navajo Indians in, the American desert, but for large parts of Canada. And I just say I don't do that dogmatically. I don't engage in that kind of conversation with a sort of assumption like, oh, you have to agree with me that it's not really that much worse on one side of the racial divide versus the other. I'm really asking the question in a genuinely Socratic way. And it's possible they're going to tell me, oh, no, that's not true at all. The white settlement just outside of the First Nations reservation, they're all sober and hardworking, and they don't have problems with alcoholism at all. But every single time I've had a conversation like that, the reply has been, wow, I never thought about that, but you're right. If you just drive your car 5 minutes past the gate, the next white town, or all the several white towns in small cities, they're really hopeless places that are full of alcoholics and drug addicts and quote unquote laziness. Does the word lazy really mean lazy in that sense? In this context, probably not. Probably is referring to alcoholism and drug addiction and what have you. And also, of course, lack of access to education, or just lack of education, period. But I mean, do you think if you go to the nearest, white town, as mentioned, what are the levels of education you find there, so on and so forth? So yeah, that's a kind of conversation I've had many times. But of course, sometimes you're talking about First Nations people that live in a major city like Montreal. It would not apply to every situation and every scenario. Okay. Have I ever met a First Nations person who went vegan or tried it for some time? I think so. I think I have. I think I've met several. And I think it is for the reasons I already mentioned. Sorry, I can't put that specific a moniker on it. But yeah, I think all of them started off with an awareness that factory farming was evil, but they still regarded hunting as morally good. And then as life went on, started to question how they're going to live a meaningful life, this sort of thing. Yeah. Anyway. Arthur Freminger asks, would you ever... Okay, so this is a change of time. I feel like I should press stop and start another video. For instance, I don't mind, though. It's a good question. Would you advocate that vegans aim for higher amounts of protein like you have been doing recently? So the problem with my diet recently has been inconsistency in access to protein. The good thing about using protein powder is that you can be lazy. It doesn't take very much time to prepare. And if you use it consistently, it can be part of a healthy, balanced diet. My problem is that I've been having a lot of protein powder, and then I ran out of protein powder. It was actually just because of delivery. There was a strike. The mailman went on strike. The postal service went on strike. So the protein didn't arrive for a week. It was a week late, and I had 1 week with no protein powder. And, I feel like I'm in a crisis. So... there are advantages and disadvantages to my super high protein diet. And I've got to say, it was really awful having to try to cope suddenly without protein powder when I wasn't used to it. If I had just been set up, if you had been more ready, if you had just been a couple days ahead in your diet transition, I'll stop soon, but if you had been already set up with your yams, we're now into yams and potatoes. We're now really doing the McDougall diet. To some extent, McDougall diet, to some extent, Nina and Randa's diet. But if you had the yams on lock, and if I'd already gotten into the oatmeal, that wouldn't have been as bad. But when I ran out of protein powder this time...
You're anti-bean. That's where I'm getting my protein.
Can you believe this, woman? You have the heedless temerity to say that I am anti-bean. Okay. I have just gotten out of a bus with you. One of us was farting. The whole bus ride.
Oh my god! Everyone's gonna think I'm like an acne face, nagging bitchy girlfriend.
This is why you have to tune in for the unedited live stream. So my girlfriend's is many beans. After a certain time of day, I do not eat beans, and there's no hard number. But like, she sometimes asks me at 6 o'clock at night, "Do you want to eat beans?" And I sometimes say no. It is also true if I'm going to go to the gym and try to lift weights heavily, I will probably not want to eat beans. I won't want to eat beans before going to the gym. You could, but you're kind of pushing your luck kind of thing. So yeah, that's another factor. And she says I'm anti-bean. Well, I don't know. I think I eat a lot of beans when I can. I'm pro-bean, but you just spent half the ferry ride and the bus ride farting, and I wasn't farting. And that relates to the fact that I didn't eat beans and you did late in the evening. So yeah, protein. So what was my point was just, if I had my game on lock with yams, sweet potatoes, and oatmeal, I could have done okay when I stopped the protein powder, but I didn't. I was really in a tough situation when I ran out of protein powder this time, and I was really suffering. I gained some body fat and probably lost some muscle tissue too, because I was trying to scrape by with just soy milk, and I didn't know when the postal strike would end and the package would. So there are advantages, but for sure, protein powder, the protein powder I use is made out of peas, PEA, pea protein. And it's a low effort, time efficient way to get a ton of protein into your body. I don't know.
Did you bring some with you on the trip?
No.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm doing. So right now. I'm getting on the McDougall diet with her, and I'm also not going to be lifting weights. I'm going to be lifting my daughter. I'm going to be lifting. How much do you think she weighs? My 100-pound daughter onto my shoulders. What does she weigh?
I don't know.
Should put on scale. I hope I don't break my back this time. All right. An anonymous contributor. I didn't know you could comment anonymously here, but apparently you can. Do you know Spheerage's YouTube? So by the way, I'm choosing to call him Spheerage. I know that is not the correct pronunciation. It's my joking mispronunciation. Do I know his series? Yeah. I have a couple different videos criticizing Spheerage. You can see those videos, but come on, it's enough already. All right. Oh, yeah. So Nicholas Can says, the college I'm going to is one of the 2 federally funded native colleges in the States. It's been an interesting experience of our. I'm certain I made a photocopied handout for the Chinese students, and I explained in both English and Chinese. I'm certain your college, whichever one it is, was on my handout. I researched it. Again, I wrote about it in both English and Chinese. We did a lecture. We did an in-class exercise talking about this stuff. Yeah, I mean, hey, you know what the best thing is about going to a Native American college? The collectible sports gear. Buy every sports jersey for those teams, the obscure like First Nations teams, you know? They have really cool, the logos of the sport. That's what I'd want, as long as they're vegan, as long as not, yeah, sure. I'd love to have that, to have the, then those will be collector's items. I'm sure just 10 years from now or something. All that stuff is probably worth money to collectors. All right. Charles Smith says, let's hear another one of your Sockmas fables. Okay, I could do that, and then I could end the recording there. All right, why not? I have it here as a file. Okay, so this one is the fable of Socrates and the. What should I do? Socrates and the pig? I was going to do Socrates and the raccoon. That's what I was going to do. Okay, so Socrates and the raccoon. The only thing I note is I might have to just add a few words to make it clear when the raccoon is speaking, in contrast to when Socrates is speaking. Yeah, you guys may pick up on it. You're a bright audience. Phlegmface is going back to sleep. Good night, Phlegmface. Thanks for joining us. There were some controversy storming about yams versus beans in the comment section that we don't need to review. So I'll read you guys the story of Socrates and the raccoon. That'll be the bedtime story for Phlegmface, and then you'll go to bed. But you will see this does implicitly play with questions of both veganism and freeganism and some of the justifications for eating meat that even are discussed in the vegan movement, and it raises some other philosophical issues that a 5-year-old can understand. So Nicholas Can just commented, you can get all kinds of free swag. The team sports. That's what I want. I want First Nations. I want Indigenous Peoples merchandised, logoed sports apparel. Okay, the story of Socrates and the raccoon. The raccoon spoke to Socrates in a voice awkward and ashamed. The street was strewn with garbage, and he knew that he was blamed. Why do they hate me for eating garbage? To them it's nothing. For me it's every meal. If I take something thrown away, in what sense can you say I steal? Whenever a beaver builds a fortress, at the start he steals a tree. He and I are just as cute, and yet they say the only one who steals is me. You think the bear is grave and noble as he robs honey from the bees, and the bees stole it from the flowers, stealing something stolen by degrees. The owl, he eats mice and rabbits, and people say he's wise. Does he steal nothing from the woods in robbing rabbits of their lives? It would be a wise sort of hunter that could have a meal without stealing. If the owl could truly take the flesh and leave the mice their life and feeling. How is it humans wrote the law to say that what I do is theft? I'm not harming anyone. I'm eating only what you've left. And now Socrates replies, the raccoon is just as cute as a beaver, and a raven looks rather like a bat. But beavers and birds are building things, and there's an honor seen in that. The beaver makes his wooden fortress. The raven creates his little twiggy tower. The bee makes something new and beautiful with what it gathers from the flower. It's not the harm that people think of, Socrates now replied. They think of what is made and built, not of what's been destroyed or died. What a terrible philosophy, Socrates. So this is the raccoon now replying. What a terrible philosophy, Socrates. You think the harm should be forgotten for the use. You'd cut down all the trees for making houses, saying, we don't steal, we produce. Why can't you teach owls to eat garbage if both Socrates and the owls are so wise? They would never harm another rabbit. Instead, it's me you all despise. The raccoon was most distraught now. Your laws are not even worth discussing. In a better world, we'd all eat garbage, harming no one and depriving them of nothing. I understand your pride in eating garbage, replies Socrates, but it is still something that you take. We respect the beaver, bee, and bird on account of what they make. And it's unfair and it's petty, but the raccoon is someone we cannot trust. The bee borrows from the flowers, but you come to gather things from us. The harm you do is not in stealing. That's not my final lesson. In this street, there's garbage all around. Another place you've left a mess in. Your philosophy, raccoon, is to boast of how little you subtract, but you must think of what you add to this world in evaluating how you act. The beavers are good neighbors, and the bears hide away in caves, but you expect us to clean up for you constantly. You treat us as your slaves. For messy children, there's a lesson here. Your parents help you clean up every day. But if you live like the raccoon, you'll be mistrusted the same way.